All right, good afternoon and welcome to the Vermont Legislature's House Committee on Environment and Energy. This afternoon, we are going to continue with conversations about solid waste. And our first witness this afternoon is Susan Collins, the president of the Container Recycling Institute. Ms. Collins.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members of the committee, for inviting me today. I've got a presentation for you on the benefits of container deposit laws with some the latest information on the worldwide trends and the national trends, as well as some information on the recovery rates and where Vermont is in terms of needing to modernize its law. So with that, I'll see if we can get the presentation started. It'll take me a second here to choose my presentation and to share it in the right format. There we go. That should be working.
You can see it. Looks good.
Fantastic. Thank you for the feedback. So again, thank you for inviting me to speak today. My name is Susan Collins. I'm president of the Container Recycling Institute. The organization has been around for 30 years, working on the subject of beverage container deposit laws. And I've been with the organization for about 13 years now. So this is the subject that I work on the most. So we'll start with the basics of what a container deposit law is and how it requires the distributors and retailers to collect a minimum refundable deposit, usually 5 or 10 cents on certain containers, beverages. It creates a privately funded collection infrastructure for beverage containers. That means this is the one type of recyclable in most places that is recycled through the use of no taxpayer funds at all. And it makes the producers and consumers responsible for their packaging waste. So I'm going to use probably the word deposit, but other words that are used are bottle bill or container deposit law or deposit refund law. It's amazing how many names it has around the world. So this is sort of what it looks like visually. The container deposits work in the same way that sales transactions work. You know, the distributor sells the beverages to the retailer sells the beverages to the consumers. And I know you're all familiar with this because you live in a state that has container deposits. So then the system also works its way in reverse. When you're finished drinking your beverage, you return it to a retailer or a redemption center. They give you the deposit back. Then they return that container back up through the product chain up to the distributor to get the deposit refunded to them. So at the end of the day, this nickel or dime has moved around, but nobody has lost any money if the container's been returned. It's just a deposit, you put it down and you get it back in the end. Little animation there on the slide. So the benefits of the container deposit systems are many. First of all, they produce really high recycling rates. The average worldwide is more than 80% for all of the container deposit laws worldwide. And there's about 60 programs in operation worldwide with another 10 in the implementation stages. They produce really clean recycled materials for manufacturing. And I can't emphasize that enough. You know this when you return your beverage containers, that plastic stays with plastic, aluminum stays with aluminum, glass stays with glass. There's no opportunity for cross-contamination between the materials because they're always kept separate and clean. It also creates jobs and new businesses. It shifts the end-of-life cost for used beverage containers to the producers, again, not to the taxpayers. It reduces litter. It conserves energy and natural resources and greenhouse gases, and it prevents pollution that happens from manufacturing new containers from virgin materials. And I'll touch on all of these a little bit more deeply in the next couple of slides. So there have been many, many litter studies that have been done all over the world. I'm just giving one example on this one slide of 5 Great Lakes states. And I'm sorry, it's hard to see what the states are at the bottom. It's Indiana, Wisconsin, Ohio, Illinois, and Michigan. Michigan is the only one of those 5 states that has a beverage container deposit law. And you can see here that the beverage container litter that they found in the litter study was half as much in Michigan as it was in the other states. This same pattern has proven out around the world, so much so that an Australian institute gathered all of the litter data from around the world and found that that was indeed the case. Places with beverage container deposit laws have about half as much beverage container litter as places that don't have the laws. And of course, some of the items are going to be littered because they aren't part of the deposit law. For example, in Vermont, there's no incentive for somebody to pick up a water bottle because there isn't a deposit on it in Vermont. So here's another study, national. This one's pretty recent, from Keep America Beautiful. They also found that there was substantially more deposit material per capita in non-bottle bill states than in bottle bill states by a difference of a 2-to-1 ratio. That's the same thing. You get half as much beverage container litter if you have a bottle bill in place. So moving on to another environmental benefit, the energy required to replace the beverage containers that we waste nationally is enough energy to power 3 million households. So that's the potential here. If we had a national deposit law, we could save enough energy to power 3 million households. Similarly, greenhouse gas emissions, if we had a national deposit law, we could dramatically reduce our greenhouse gas emissions through the recycling process. So with all of those benefits, beverage container deposit laws have been enormously popular, especially in the last 6 years. Up through 2017, there were enough deposit laws around the world to cover almost 300 million people. And then in the next 4 to 5 years, enough new deposit laws passed that it covered twice as many people. So in that 5-year period, the population covered by deposit laws around the world more than doubled. And this is a map that's sort of showing you that it's everywhere. It's, you know, all the way from Australia to North America to Europe to India, different island nations all around the world. These laws are enormously popular because of the benefits that they bring. So here's what that same trend looks like, graphed out, the number of people covered. And we keep having to update this slide as new deposit laws get introduced. So just in 2022, Spain announced they would have a new deposit law. So did Uruguay. And we saw expansions pass in Connecticut and California and Quebec. This is a list of some of the places that you already saw on the map, from Romania to Turkey to New Zealand to different states in Australia, just all over the world. New deposit laws are going in place, just enormous popularity. But here in the United States, we're, you know, moving a little more slowly, even though we were the place where all of this started. With, you know, Oregon and Vermont, 2 of the first in the world in the early 1970s. But we've sort of hit a stall point now. So these are the 10 states in the United States that have deposit laws. And here's a look at just in 2022, 8 different states saw bottle bills be proposed. They didn't pass in those 8 states, but this is the level of interest that we're seeing. And I know already this year that there are going to be at least another 7 states that are going to introduce deposit legislation. Also, it's been introduced for the past couple of years in the United States Congress. So there were 2 different national container deposit laws that were introduced, and there's a lot of activity, a lot of discussion happening nationally. Okay, so this is a point that I really want to drive home because it's one of the most commonly misunderstood things. People often think that curbside recycling is some sort of a substitute for beverage container deposit laws, but it couldn't be further from the truth. It's the amount of material that you can possibly get from using curbside recycling alone is way less, and it's way lower quality material. There's no way curbside recycling alone will ever be a substitute for container deposit laws. This is a look over time. The blue line is the overall US beverage container recycling rate, which has dropped over these last couple of decades. And the percent of population served by curbside programs is on the red line, and it has risen. So as curbside recycling has grown in the United States, ironically, the beverage container recycling rate has actually dropped over that period of time. And here's another look at this, this issue of curbside recycling. We did some modeling to figure out where all the beverage containers are produced. And we made very generous assumptions that if everybody put all of their containers in their curbside recycling bins, and then they moved through the imperfect process of curbside recycling, what would be the total recycling rate for beverage containers? And it's only about 38%, which is basically every container deposit law in the world gets at least that rate or higher. And most of them, the average worldwide is 80%. So container deposit laws are at least twice as effective as beverage container recycling through curbside. Here's another look at that. Nationally, the containers in the US that are on deposit have a 65% redemption rate, and the containers that are not on deposit have a 24% recycling rate nationally. And then here it is, the same information broken down by the type of container, by aluminum versus PET plastic versus glass bottles. And just a definition, when I say PET plastic, I mean the plastic that is used to make water bottles and soda bottles, for example. So what ends up happening is that the deposit states contribute an outsized proportion of beverage containers back to the beverage industry for recycling. So of all of the material that gets recycled, it's the last two bars on the right, about half of the material that is recycled and able to go back into bottles and cans again comes from just the 10 deposit states, even though those 10 deposit states only have 27% of the US population. This is something that industry is very aware of. During the pandemic, there was a partial shutdown of container deposit programs, and it caused a major supply chain disruption where they weren't getting the recycled material that they needed to make new bottles and cans again. So the growth that is occurring is in one single beverage type. The single largest category of beverages now is bottled water. It surpasses sales of beer, surpasses sales of soda. This chart shows us going from about 3 billion containers of water every year in 1996 up to about 71 billion in 2018. And the growth just continues. I just received numbers last week. The national numbers are now at 86 billion bottles of water for 2021. That's the latest data available, and it's not on this chart yet. So this is the single biggest growth area, and it continues to grow at about 5% per year. So all of this ties into the circular economy and the need for the beverage companies to get the material back, the recycled material back, to put recycled content into their bottles and cans so that the bottles and cans are truly circular. So the differences between deposit PET and curbside PET on average are that they, first of all, they go to different facilities. Some facilities handle only deposit material, and some facilities handle only curbside material. The pricing is different, with deposit grade material at a much higher price because it's less contaminated and it requires less money basically to run through the operation. The contamination percentage is much lower with deposit material. So there are fewer extra costs to have to deal with the contamination if you have deposit material, but a lot of extra costs to deal with the contamination in curbside material. And then the product use potential, because it's good, clean, food grade material, it can be used to make food and beverage bottles again, which is different than curbside material. Also, I've mentioned that the deposit scrap is more valuable. That's true for aluminum and glass and PET plastic. Again, it's cleaner material. It's a completely different grade, so it's worth more money. This chart is now showing the struggle that the beverage industry has had over the years in putting recycled content in their PET plastic bottles. The highest they've ever gotten to is 11.5%. So on average, 90% of all of the plastic that's been used to make beverage bottles has been virgin plastic, at least 90% over time. Meanwhile, all of the beverage companies now have goals to increase their level of recycled content. And there are 4 states that have now passed laws requiring all the beverage companies to meet certain levels of recycled content. And this is a chicken or egg thing. You can't put the recycled content into the containers if you don't have the recycled content. And the only place you're going to get that is from container deposit programs. So nationally, the beverage industry needs a lot more states to pass beverage container deposit laws so that they have the material they need to put into their containers. So the public policy positions that have come out in support of container deposit laws, I have seen a radical shift over the last 3 years or 4 years, where trade associations that didn't used to have a policy position in favor now do. So the Aluminum Association is in favor, the Association of Plastic Recyclers is in favor, and as is the Glass Packaging Institute. And then all of these different major companies have plastics reduction commitments as well. They have all come out publicly. These are all very new statements that have come out in the last couple of years, either saying that they're going to get to a certain percentage of recycled content, or that their packaging is going to be 100% reusable or recyclable, various types of public commitments that have been put out there in the last few years. Even Coca-Cola in Europe, this is different than their posture in the United States, but in Europe, I'm actually going to read this because it's really powerful language. The head of sustainability for Coca-Cola in Europe said, "We want all our packaging to be recovered, and we see from those schemes in other countries that you can get high 80 and low 90% recovery rates on plastic packaging. There's no reason why in the UK we should not be striving for a scheme that achieves those kind of outcomes." This is the supporters. We've put some logos on here of some organizations that have come out publicly in favor of container deposits. And on this slide, I looked at it carefully this morning and realized that if I had made this same slide just 3 or 4 years ago, it would only have 3 or 4 logos on it. The rest of these logos are all organizations that have changed their position and are now in favor of container deposit laws, and they weren't 5 years ago. So now we're getting into, what does Vermont need to do? What's Vermont's role in all of this? I've got 3 slides here that all go together, that put the pieces together for everybody. We often talk about redemption rates, but when you put redemption rates in conjunction with the coverage of your program and multiply those 2 together, you realize what the true impact of your program is. So on this slide, Vermont looks pretty good with a 75 redemption rate. These data are from 2019. So that's what your program is getting currently. But on this next slide, this is looking at a different thing. This is looking at the percentage of beverage units that are actually covered by your deposit program. And Vermont's program only covers about 48% of the beverages. Remember, I said bottled water, huge category. Bottled water isn't covered in Vermont. So that means the coverage of the program is only 48%. It's like having half a bottle bill. Once you put those 2 pieces together on this next slide here, Vermont's capture of all the beverages that are sold in the state is only 36%. And that's because the beverages aren't covered. That redemption rate of 75% is a fantastic redemption rate, but with only half of the containers covered, then the overall impact is only 36%. And you really want to be more like at 75 or 80%. So that's one of the most important things about the need for modernization in Vermont. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the deposit value at only 5 cents. The worldwide trend is for much greater than that. For example, the Canadian provinces all have a deposit value of at least 10 cents. Connecticut is updating its program so that it has a deposit value of 10 cents. That's going to kick in next January. So you can see here on this slide, how a number of the states in the United States, Connecticut, Oregon, some of the containers in California, all at 10 cents. Another example worldwide is that Ireland is starting a new deposit program, and they're starting at 15 cents. They're just jumping right to 15, jumping right over 10. So that's really the trend of at least 10 cents. The United States are the only programs in the world that are starting out at 5 cents. I'm getting close to the end of my slides, but one subject that I wanted to touch on here was to introduce the concept of a producer responsibility organization, because that's something that's sort of new to Vermont. It was introduced in the legislation last year. It had a lot of industry support. It was the beverage industry that was really coming forward and saying that they wanted a producer responsibility organization. What you might not know about Vermont's program right now, because it's something that happens behind the scenes, is that many of the beverage companies in the state have come together to form a kind of co-op that's called a commingling agreement. But there are a lot of stragglers, a lot of companies that are still outside of the commingling agreement, which is sort of hampering its efficiencies. What the beverage industry wants to do is to sort of operate as one entity for the purposes of maintaining the back end of the program, collecting the containers, and making it so that all the containers don't have to be sorted into so many categories in order to return them to this distributor or that distributor. If they can all be mixed together and recycled together, there are great economies of scale and efficiencies. And so the commingling agreement system has been in place for several years. What the beverage industry wants to do is more formally make that a universal thing, where everybody is in one commingling agreement, and they're calling that a producer responsibility organization. Most of the programs around the world do operate as a single system with a producer responsibility organization handling that. Because otherwise this piecemeal approach is very inefficient. So as Vermont looks to potentially switching to a producer responsibility organization method of management, as that happens, what's written into law, the accountability measures must be equivalent to the current system so that you're still getting all the benefits and so that consumers are protected. And that means you have to have the right reporting and metrics and penalties or mandates for non-compliance, just like you do now with the individual distributors, but put all of those requirements on the producer responsibility organization and have a lot of monitoring and oversight. So that's just to introduce that concept. I'm just about done here, last 2 slides. This one slide is a picture for you. I wanted to know what one person's usage of beverage containers per year looked like. So this is what one person average in the US. It's more than 800 containers per person. And it's all the different types of wine and soda and water and all aluminum and plastic and glass and paper cartons, and they're all in exactly the right proportions. So this is truly a representation of one person's consumption of beverage containers. And it illustrates that that is a huge pile of stuff. It's often trivialized, and it is not trivial. It's really important for us to get this stuff recycled into the circular economy and save all those greenhouse gases and energy use. And have a lot more efficiency rather than throwing it all in the landfill. So my last slide here is contact information. We have 2 websites, telephone numbers here, email address, anything you need to do to contact me if you have any questions later. Thank you.
Thank you. Members have questions? Seeing any? All right. Yeah, thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Helpful overview. All right. With that, we'll move on to our next witnesses. Are you going to present separately or together?
I'll go first.
Okay, sure.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Paul Burns, and I am the Executive Director of VPIRG, the Vermont Public Interest Research Group. I know many of you, but I haven't had a chance to meet all of you, so it's a pleasure to be here and certainly be in front of this brand new committee for the very first time, though I have sat in this chair a few times. So again, nice to see you. I wanted to provide a brief overview of the organization and our interest in this broad policy area of environment and waste issues, a little bit about some of our history on Bottle Bill, and then I will defer to my colleague, Marcy Gallagher, who will talk more specifically about kind of present day issues with Bottle Bill and where we hope to go from here. VPIRG as an organization, though, celebrated our 50th anniversary last year. That happens to coincide with when the Bottle Bill was passed. Unrelated, but happy coincidence that we share that anniversary. We're the largest consumer and environmental advocacy organization in Vermont. We have about 20,000 members all across the state. Our mission is to protect and promote the health and well-being of Vermont's people, environment, and locally based economy. And we do that by informing and mobilizing people across the state. Some of you may have had a VPIRG canvasser knock on your door once or twice. And that is one way that we get out into every single legislative district across the state. We have members in every House and obviously every Senate district across the state. We work on a pretty broad range of issues here in the legislature, and you'll see a number of my colleagues who work for VPIRG on issues like climate and energy, of course, that you'll be seeing in this committee, consumer protection, democracy issues, healthcare, justice issues, environmental protection, and more. In the area of the environment, we have a long history of work on toxic chemicals, not just tailpipe and smokestack, but chemicals that are in products. And more we're trying to go upstream to try to prevent the use of these chemicals in products so that we have fewer risks associated with the creation of the product, the use of the product, the disposal of the product, and the waste that is related to that along every step. We also work on waste issues. Plastic pollution was an issue that the chair and colleagues, some of your predecessors worked on just a few years ago, passing the nation's strongest law dealing with single-use plastic pollution as an example. We've worked on end of life for waste issues, dealing with landfill issues, for instance. I know these issues continue. The Rep. Sims and probably others have legislation proposed dealing with landfills, or how we look at the next landfill siting in this state, and we'll probably be talking more about that at another time. But composting issues and other waste diversion methods are some of the things that we've been involved in, and also including universal recycling laws, clean water laws, and of course, the Bottle Bill. I personally have been involved in these issues for a long time. I've been the executive director of VPIRG for a little over 22 years now, but I've been working for PIRGs for more than 35 years. And just as an example, this is me here in 1991, working on, you see that, John? Working on waste issues, taking the grocery store Wegmans to task for their use of plastic bags in 1991. And this was all sorts of other plastic waste that we were protesting and saying, you should stop making them. Remember the Fling, the Kodak Fling? Fling, it was a disposable camera. You would use it, take your photos, and throw away the whole camera. And the name Fling was kind of beautiful for that. I mean, can you believe it? So we thought that was a bad idea, and eventually they came to agree. So I've been involved in these issues for a long time. It's amazing how some of them just keep coming back. But I've been really pleased here in Vermont to be able to work with policymakers on a number of, I think, creative solutions. And truly, Vermont is one of a handful of states that has been making significant progress when it comes to trying to reduce waste. We have a zero waste program that we call, and that means we're trying to get as close as possible to zero waste. You heard earlier testimony, and you all just are thoughtful enough to understand we're not going to get to actually zero waste anytime real soon. But that should be the solution that we seek. I mean, if not zero waste, how much waste would you like to create? You know, it makes sense to try to create products that can be reused. Or what about less packaging overall? You know, so remember the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. We really believe in that. And reducing means source pollution, create as little of the material or the product, or certainly the packaging, as possible. And certainly for us, a corollary there is less toxic material in any of the products or certainly packaging that you're using. So not just overall waste, but the contents of that as well. Reuse is the second priority. And of course, that means, whenever possible, repairing, reusing, refilling of products when you can, instead of throwing them away, or even recycling, which is the third category. Whenever you can't reduce or reuse, think about ways to recycle. Now, not all recycling is the same. You've heard some about that. Recycling, we think of real recycling as those chasing arrows. And that really means you're taking a product, let's say a bottle, and if it can't be refilled right now, recycling it so that it is actually turned into a new bottle again. Glass bottles can be turned into new glass bottles an infinite number of times. Even plastic bottles can be recycled a number of times as well. And that gets you the greatest environmental benefits if you're actually recycling a product into a new product that itself can be used and recycled again and again. We distinguish that from collecting recyclable material and using it just once more. That might be considered downcycling, using material, for instance, for road construction, or to make a bench or something like that. That's better than littering, and it's better than just throwing it into a landfill to begin with. But you don't get all of the connected benefits to recycling if you use it just one more time. That's not chasing arrows. That's an arrow to one other thing. And again, better than litter and better than landfill, but not as good as real recycling. Okay, over the last 5 decades, again, VPIRG has been associated with numerous environmental laws, regulations, and policies addressing waste and toxics, landfilling, composting, and recycling. As I noted, the Bottle Bill was passed in 1972, which really was initially passed as an anti-litter law. Some of you who know your history know that that's what it was about. That was the argument why we needed this. There were all sorts of cans and bottles on the side of the road, and we needed to provide an incentive for people not to throw cans out of your car or just leave them wherever you were when you consumed them. Remember that it applied to these carbonated beverages for the most part. Vermont's law now also includes liquor, but initially it was carbonated single-use beverages, which means that these are beverages that are often consumed on the go, away from home. And you needed to provide an incentive for somebody to be able to keep that thing and bring it back for redemption. And so the idea of putting a nickel deposit on it was created. As was noted by Susan Collins, Vermont was one of the first 2 states, Oregon being the other to pass. I think we were the first 2 states with Bottle Bill programs. A deposit of 5 cents in 1972 is where we started and where we sit today. As you can imagine, a deposit of 5 cents or 5 cents in 1972 would be worth a lot more today. So I just looked it up before coming over here. We gave a 2022 estimate of 33 cents. I don't think that takes full inflation into account over probably the last 10 or 12 months. So it's probably more than that today. If we really kept pace with inflation, that's what the deposit would be today. But amazingly, Vermonters have been they like this program, and they have kept redeeming their containers at a remarkable rate. Susan mentioned 75%. It's about 75 to 77%, a little bit higher for the liquor bottles in the state, according to state data. So that's shows, we're good people here. We like to do recycling. I guess that's it. And even at a nickel, you get a pretty good rate of return on that and redemption. Other states that remain at a nickel have dropped down to closer to 50%. Even our neighbor in Massachusetts and Connecticut had dropped into the 50s. And that was one of the reasons why Connecticut legislators raised their deposit to 10 cents just last year, for instance. But again, this has been a remarkable success overall. More than 10 billion beverage containers, we estimate, have been recycled through the Bottle Bill program since 1972, 10 billion containers. And the vast majority of those beverage containers have been turned into new products again, most often new beverage containers. So again, you've heard some of that, and Marcy will talk a little bit more about some of those specifics. But the law has not been substantially upgraded in more than 3 decades. It was the early 1990s when liquor was added to the beverage system here. And since then, it's basically been on autopilot. People continue to abide by the law, and it continues to work reasonably well, but it truly does need an update after 50 years. And I should say Vermonters love this law, and we have done polling on this a couple of times over the past 12 years. And found each time high percentages of Vermonters in favor of the current program and also in favor of expanding the program. And so I guess it is just rare if you think about environmental programs that we have today, not too many would find nearly 9 out of 10 in favor of the environmental program that we have, particularly programs that could be updated so easily, that work well and yet could be updated so easily. So you have this opportunity in front of you. And it's also an opportunity that actually generates revenue for the state. Fewer programs still, or fewer programs that could do that I can think of. This program already generates about $3 million a year for clean water programs through the unclaimed nickels. And that could be expanded. And again, that's part of the ideas that Marcy will share with you. So that's it for me as a general introduction. I'm happy to answer any questions now or perhaps after Marcy speaks.
Representative Pat.
I wondered about this, but in the history of the bottle bill in Vermont, so what liquor was added in whatever year that was. What is the rationale for having done that or for not having done wine bottles at the same? Was that just too much, or was there more of a reason for that?
There's not a technical reason. It's not based on science. Let me say that a wine bottle is just like a liquor bottle. I mean, it's heavy and it's glass. And what I've been told is had more to do with the politics of the situation than anything else. And that has been true in certain other states as well. I mean, we're talking about pretty powerful lobbying interests at play here. But for the most part, the rest of it, so that's the question for wine, I think. But for a lot of the other containers, as I think you heard earlier, and as you would just imagine, just didn't exist early on in 1972. A lot of the single-use beverages that we think about in sports drinks and teas and the like, they weren't around in 1972, so they weren't considered as a possibility for this. Over time, I think, it's been a little bit of a third rail. Oh, you can't possibly change the bottle bill. Several years ago, Vermont did change the bottle bill so that the unclaimed deposits went to the state instead of staying with the beverage industry. That was probably, if it's $3 million a year, you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that ultimately went to the beverage industry instead of to the state for environmental programs like recycling or clean water. But I think with that change, when the legislature demonstrated, no, we're willing to make changes to this law, that opened the possibility of making more substantive changes and updates to the program.
Representative Sibilia.
Hi, Paul.
Hello.
Thank you for your testimony. Can you, newcomer to the committee, not newcomer to the discussion on the floor, but can you remind us of the key arguments that we will hear about this and what you would say about those?
Sure. And they are changing, and some of the players are changing. As Susan Collins mentioned in one of those slides, we're seeing now the industry that actually does the recycling and some of the producers of the beverages themselves who have traditionally, certainly the beverage producers have opposed this, and the waste industry broadly considered have been opposing this. And certain mom and pop, in particular mom and pop stores, because they had to collect the containers again, have expressed concerns. So let me take each of those. I think the beverage industry, they didn't like the idea that they were singled out. They were creating a product just like everybody else. Why should we be the only ones to have a program apply to our product and force us to do more? It was an early example of an extended producer responsibility program. Now, Vermont has passed 7 or 8 different EPR programs, and a number of other states have done the same. And I think it's becoming, there is a rationale for this. Either the product itself differs, as with batteries or electronics, or in this case, single-use beverages, there was a reason why you would treat it a little bit differently than the rest of the waste stream. And again, I think you've heard some of the reasons why for that. So the beverage industry didn't like it, but that was before they really had any idea that they might start using more of this material in their product, in their new plastic bottles. They never were really going to do that. But now, because of the heavy pushback against plastic pollution and addressing climate issues, the beverage industry has really been forced, and Europe is ahead of us here. So that's why you see European Coca-Cola on board as favoring this. You didn't see US Coca-Cola on that if you looked carefully. But Coca-Cola, I mean, it's the same product in the same container, but they have been forced politically there to recognize where we're going to have to increase the recycled content. And they are making this pledge voluntarily here too. And I think they're going to come around here to recognize that they need clean content if they're going to put recycled material into that production line again. So I think that has been the argument. And you're seeing a nuanced shift in position from the beverage industry there. With respect to the waste industry, it's not just a monolith any longer. CSWD runs one of the, Chittenden Solid Waste District, and you heard Jen Holiday testifying earlier today. They own the Chittenden County Material Recovery Facility, the MRF there that she talked about, and they just got the okay to build a new material recovery facility. The other material recovery facility in the state is owned by Casella, and that is in Rutland. They have traditionally opposed any programs that might take material away from curbside programs and therefore away from their trucks that dump it into their recycling facility. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is they like aluminum, particularly aluminum cans that would come to them. If you didn't have any bottle bill, all of those beer and soda cans would go to them, and they make money off that because aluminum has value. Yes.
They make more money than the 5-cent deposit? Is it worth more than the 5-cent deposit?
That's a good question to ask them. I don't think per can it is more than 5-cent deposit.
Sorry.
And they have made money. Marcia may have that here, but they have made money on PET plastic. That's water and soda bottles, that type of thing. They traditionally and today do not make money on glass, and so, but they do make money on a tipping fee when the truck dumps at the material recovery facility or the MRF. You pay a certain amount per ton. What's the heaviest thing in the recycling truck? It's glass. Casella likes to have that glass dumped there. I'm not saying you hear this argument directly from them, but they get a lot of tip fee money for that glass. And so they don't want to lose that. Also, glass contaminates a lot of the rest of the stuff. And when you heard about diversion rates earlier and all that, frankly, we're a little skeptical that Chittenden County has a 61% diversion rate and the statewide recycling or diversion rate is 35%. It doesn't really add up. The way we do it, you would have to have almost no recycling and diversion, anyplace else for those numbers to just add up. So we color me skeptical about some of that, and we have some questions about how you get to those numbers. We've had back and forth. We just say there's an area ripe for a little bit further investigation or consideration there. But also, when you just talk about separating out what goes directly from the truck to the landfill versus what goes to the material recovery facility, there's still tons of stuff that comes out of the recycling facility, too dirty, too contaminated to be recycled. That then goes to the landfill and isn't considered in their numbers that goes to the landfill because it initially went to the recycling facility. And years ago, when CSWD, the Chittenden Solid Waste District, was found to be in violation. Jen Holiday mentioned this earlier, but wasn't specific. From the years 2013 to 2018, they dumped 18,000 tons of glass illegally, kind of over the side of the road and property that they maintained, and into an old landfill that they opened up again to dump the glass in, all without approval or notice to the state environmental agency. And that's what led to the fine from the Attorney General's office of $400,000, a structured payment thing there. And it was only after that they were caught that they stopped doing it. So that was considered diverted. That glass was being dumped into a landfill at that time, I believe, went into the state numbers of diversion or recycling. So anyway, we have some questions about that whole process. John Brave, to my right here, has more information about that glass dumping and helped to bring it to public attention, credit where it is due. But Chittenden Solid Waste District, when they were in the process of requesting approval for their new material recovery facility, VPIRG had a number of questions about that, and we had back and forth in writing because I said, I don't want to mischaracterize anything in an oral conversation with you. I want it all in writing. We would be happy to share that with the committee. Most of it won't be of particular value to this conversation because it was about the MRF and the finances and how that worked, but there were specific questions about the bottle bill, for instance. And in that, they made clear that an expanded bottle bill doesn't affect their finances for a new material recovery facility. They don't need the additional aluminum or PET plastic to make it work. And so if you hear from Casella later on, we absolutely need that or else we're going to go belly up, you have a counter argument or a counter position from the other large material recovery facility in the state, not just my words, but theirs that I will get to you so you can see that. So that's the solid waste facilities. Let me see, the third.
Mom and pop.
Mom and pops. A lot of mom and pop stores. Of course, when we created the law, I wasn't here, but the idea was that you wanted to make it just as convenient for people to take their cans and bottles back to get the deposit as it was to purchase them in the first place, which meant having every place that sold the containers also have a responsibility to take them back. That has been the law. It continues to be the law. But the fact of the matter is very few people take them back to your corner bodega, for a redemption. And honestly, a lot of those stores don't even know that they are covered by the current law. It happens so infrequently. And when it does, they may say, we don't take those things back. And the person says, okay, I guess I'll go to the redemption center. But they are technically covered by the law. The law also includes an opportunity for them to get an exemption if they are within a certain proximity to a redemption center. That has been tinkered with over time. And at times, and we participated in that conversation, always with an eye toward making sure that there are continuing to be enough convenient locations for consumers to do it, because otherwise it doesn't work. Otherwise, it's a tax on beverages. And we don't want it to be that. We want it to be that they are actually returned to get all these environmental benefits that you were hearing about. And so with the PRO idea, the Producer Responsibility Organization, it would come with new redemption center opportunities distributed around the state and in high population areas and high density population areas, we would argue for. And that does lessen the need to even say that mom and pop stores of a certain size are covered. Very few people use it. Let's just take them out of the system. Don't force them to get an exemption. And if they're complaining about the possibility of somebody bringing a can or bottle in, let's remove that from the system. Again, it wouldn't necessarily be the number one thing I would do because I tend to side more with the consumer interest here. But it's a fair point that they make. It is a burden on them, and we could reduce that burden on the mom and pops. That's one of the reasons why we supported the PRO.
Thank you. That was comprehensive.
Yeah. There may be others, but those are the main ones.
Good question. All right, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Good afternoon, Chair Sheldon and committee members. For the record, my name is Marcy Gallagher. I'm the environmental advocate with VPIRG. And Kate, I'm going to attempt to join the Zoom so I can share a presentation, if that works.
Oh,
I'll start by saying the scrap value of aluminum is around 1 cent, and glass and plastic are both less than
Sent a
1
can.
A can.
can.
Appreciate that.
Scrap value of aluminum.
But the can tabs are worth more.
Really?
They're a pure aluminum versus a can that's
Good to know.
trying to recollect it. Trying to still do that.
Yes, they do.
Just the town?
Yes.
It takes an awful lot of.
I'm busy.
Okay, is this all working?
It looks like it's
good. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to talking about the modernization of the bottle bill, and I will be reiterating several points that have been made by Paul and others today, but hopefully these are all important enough to be repeated twice. So first and foremost, the bottle bill is Vermont's most successful recycling program, but as you've heard, it's both outdated and overburdened. So we do really need to update the program in order to maximize these really strong benefits to Vermonters, to redemption centers, other small businesses, and also to our environment. I will say one point of contention that came up last year was about redemption centers that Paul didn't mention, and I will dive into that more. So as Paul mentioned, the bottle bill modernization that passed the Senate last year was quite different from what had passed the House in 2021, which I know some of you were familiar with when it went through. VPIRG really strongly supported the legislation that passed through the House, but as the course of the next year progressed, it became clear that further changes would be needed in the Senate, and a small working group was convened by Senator Bray and Senate Natural Resources, comprised of varied interested parties. We did participate in that, and ultimately we were willing to go along with the industry-backed model, as Paul mentioned, to create a producer responsibility organization, or a PRO, as a part of these negotiations. It was not our idea, but we did ultimately recognize that there were some really strong benefits that would come along with a PRO, that include benefits, as Paul mentioned, again, to consumer convenience, to small businesses and redemption centers. Ultimately, we do still maintain that the single biggest improvement that we can make to this system is to increase the volume of containers that are flowing through the system, which is what the House overwhelmingly supported back in 2021. And as Paul mentioned, is also supported by vast majorities of Vermonters. I'm going to continue sipping my water because my mouth gets so dry. So it's really important to stress that bottle bill materials are much cleaner, much more valuable, have a higher financial value than materials that flow through our blue bin single stream systems. So these materials can be sold for more, and they can be turned into new bottles and other food grade materials rather than downcycled for just one-time uses, like construction material, for example. And this does have implications in Vermont. So I'll start with plastic. PET bottles, you've heard PET mentioned today, that's the type of plastic that are used in beverage containers. These are already a part of a well-established and closed loop recycling system where they can be efficiently recycled up to 10 times into new bottles and containers. But when we downcycle instead of recycle, we're changing from that circular system to a linear system where a product can never be recycled again and ends up as waste. All PET plastic containers in the bottle bill are made out of food grade containers, but other types of PET plastic are not food grade and actually contain toxic additives that mean that when they're mixed together, the food grade PET and the other PET, that can't possibly be made into a new plastic beverage container because it contains those additives, which are not safe for food products. And as you've heard, some states, some big corporations like Coke and Pepsi have made laws for these really sweeping recycled content standards to have 50% or more of recycled content in plastic containers, which I think many folks see the value in. But this is not possible without the expansion of more bottle bills and of bottle bill states that are existing, because again, beverages that go through single stream cannot be turned into new beverages. So we know that recycling a product back into the same product and recycling continuously is the most environmentally efficient outcome. It saves greenhouse gases and water and energy, but it also saves a lot of waste. And I do want to use a case study here because a lot of the PET plastic that is recycled through single stream in Vermont is turned into fibers like clothing and like rugs and carpets. And the reason why this is sometimes problematic is because there is a new environmental term called fast fashion. Some of you may have heard about it. It's the idea that these big corporate entities are making clothing that is really low quality. It's not meant to be worn very many times. And it's basically just chasing the latest trend. People wear it for a few months, they throw it out. The stores generate a ton of clothing and then they ship it off to other countries to be used in resale markets. So a good example of this is in Chile. Tons and tons of US clothing is shipped there every year for resale markets, but only about 30% actually gets resold. The additional 70% gets dumped into clothing dumps in deserts, like is shown here. This is at least 39,000 tons of clothes from the US in this specific dump every single year. That's the weight of 28,000 cars worth of clothing every year. The way that this all ties together is that fast fashion clothing brands, for example, H&M, which is a really prominent brand, they tout using recycled bottles to make 90% of their polyester. H&M is the second most commonly used clothing that is found in this exact dump. So it's not always a good outcome to recycle products into another product because those can be turned into waste, which in this example are then burned, and the polyester that's burned produces toxic chemicals, which burden the surrounding environmental justice communities.
Representative Sibilia has a question.
I heard you say it's not always a good idea to turn a product into another product because what would you do with it instead?
Recycle it circularly.
So just keep it in that same product stream.
Essentially, just not every outcome for a recycled product is environmentally beneficial. If you're going to turn a plastic bottle into a shirt, dump it in a desert and burn it, that's not better for the environment.
Got it.
So you have just heard about the case that was settled by Chittenden Solid Waste and the Vermont Attorney General regarding Chittenden Solid Waste illegal dumping of 18,000 tons of glass in a 5-year period. This case really reflected the very poor markets for single stream glass that have not improved very much since this happened. And when it's not dumped or stored indefinitely, most of Vermont's single stream glass is still downcycled into uses like construction and road aggregate. And glass processors, glass manufacturers agree that glass does not make sense in a single stream system. It's very often a contaminant that actually lowers the value of higher end recyclables like paper products. It also produces a lot of wear and tear on the systems and reduces the lifespan of recycling technology. And you'll hear from solid waste districts just how onerous glass is and why they really do support including wine in particular in the bottle bill. And Paul mentioned our communication with Chittenden Solid Waste this fall. I do have one specific quote that I'll read from them. CSWD supports any system that will keep glass out of the Blue Bin program, including expansion of the bottle bill to include more glass, such as wine bottles. Again, just because it's such a huge cost when it is contaminated and broken as opposed to kept in that separate bottle bill system. So we do agree using glass for landfill cover or road aggregate or construction is better than simply landfilling it, but it is not better than infinitely recycling it in that quality controlled bottle bill system. And there is an urgent need for this high quality recycled glass right now. Again, it can be recycled again and again, but that benefit is lost when it is downcycled. So one exciting point when we talk about the expansion of bottle bills and what our zero waste future looks like is refillables. This is pretty hot topic right now. The way that this connects to the bottle bill is that container deposit laws like bottle bills can establish infrastructure and consumer culture that can then be used to kickstart a refillable program. And this has already been done in Oregon, which in 2018 used its existing bottle bill infrastructure to pilot this kind of program. And they have the same drop-off location for the refillable containers and the glass deposit containers. They're easily separated. The refillables then go to a cleaning center. They get sent back to the participating breweries. The breweries fill it up with over 100 different types of beverages like beer and cider, et cetera, and go back to the consumer. There's over a dozen different local brands participating. I think Vermont, with our booming craft beer and cider industry, would be an awesome place to get this started. But I do also just want to note that it's not just local areas that are doing refillables. Coca-Cola itself is getting refillables going across the world in places like Germany and parts of Latin America. The sale of refillables is actually, refillable Coca-Cola is outpacing the sale of single-use Coca-Cola. So we are definitely on that path, and the bottle bill will help us get there.
Marcy.
Yeah.
What about the vineyards and the wineries? Like, it seems like, especially during COVID, where they had this, ran right up against a wine bottle shortage and people were drinking more wine, the obvious thing would have been to do refillables.
Yep, and in Oregon, wine is also included in their refillables program. I think it's no individual winery is going to have the capacity to jumpstart a refillables program. So it has to be started by a third party that then invites those brands to participate. And I would imagine, right, we do, as I mentioned, we have a need for this high quality glass because there is a glass shortage for beer bottles and for wine bottles. So I do think that that's an easy solution. And something I forgot to mention, a fun tidbit that I think a lot of folks don't know, is that before our 1972 bottle bill that we have today, there was actually a 1953 bottle bill that banned non-refillable containers and put a 5-cent deposit on those refillable containers. It only lasted 4 years because of lobbying by the beverage industry. But that's a fun idea, and that's how it used to be, because it used to be cheaper to have refillable containers compared to using virgin materials. Unfortunately, that's not really the case anymore, which is why we saw single-use containers really explode in the 60s, and that's the system that we still have today.
But I guess just to follow up, does it always take government intervention to get these folks to do this? Like, I'm thinking a state like California with a lot of vineyards, does it have to be a third party created by government, or do you know any jurisdiction that has said where it's happened organically?
My understanding is that in Oregon, they use the bottle bill infrastructure, which was created by the government, but it is a third party business that runs their refillables
The
program.
government told them to do it. I mean, they set it up. The legislature.
It might have worked together, but it wasn't a law that passed to get the refillable infrastructure.
May I just add, Madam Chair, the only other thing you might think about is in the area of dairy or milk bottles. Now you can go to the co-op and buy milk in a glass container and then bring it back to the co-op. So there are some instances where that has been done on a very local basis in the area of dairy, for instance. I don't know if wine,
Growlers and kombucha.
growlers and other.
Just
Oh, yeah.
about the bottles, do they have to be, in order to be refilled, does it tend to be generic bottles? So the same,
Yes.
companies are using all the same kind of, just they put their label on their generic bottle.
Exactly. This photo is the exact bottle that's used in Oregon. You can see the little bottle drop logo if you look closely. That's what their program is called. So I mentioned I would talk about redemption centers, and a lot of the feedback that we received last year. Redemption centers, for the record, from the polling that I've done, are overwhelmingly supportive of expanding the bottle bill, but they do have some really real concerns. And one huge thing is that the deposit and the handling fee have not been updated to meet inflation. So as a result, redemption centers have been really struggling to make ends meet for years. And add on top of this, pandemic workforce shortages, more and more redemption centers are on the brink of closing. And we really need to do more to improve the viability of these really important community businesses that are doing a really huge public service. So redemption centers are actually funded by what's called the handling fee that's separate from the deposit. It's a small fee that producers pay. That's how they pay to do the recycling. And so you heard mentioned some producers join a commingling agreement. I added this photo because we can talk about sorts, and it sounds like it might be some complex idea. It's actually not. These are the sorts in this photo, just different bins where a lot of containers have to be sorted by brand, but some brands can join a contract to decide. Coke and Pepsi and Dr. Pepper can say, don't worry about it. You can put all of our containers in the same bin and in the same store, and we'll figure it out on the financial side later. And that's where this huge, huge benefit of the PRO comes in, because instead of having a few brands that you can commingle together and every other one has to be sorted by brand, especially when you think about essentially doubling the number of containers we have, the number of brands with bottled water and others, it just becomes too much for the redemption centers to handle. So with the PRO, all of these containers, all of these brands can go together. That saves in a huge amount of space, a huge amount of employee time, and it also helps with another concern by redemption centers, which is just the general amount of space. Another part of this is that redemption centers have signaled that they need a more consistent pickup of the beverage containers so they don't pile up in the stores. This is something else that would be handled by the PRO under the Senate passed version. The PRO would have to guarantee a consistent pickup of containers from redemption centers. So with changes resulting in fewer sorts, more efficient employee time, and a reliable pickup schedule, redemption centers will then be able to make more money once they have that higher volume of containers. And finally, after all of this time, be able to thrive as an actually profitable business model. Yes.
If you're still talking about redemption centers, I can wait till I have a question, but I can wait till you're done.
Please go ahead.
Okay. I'm just thinking, in addition to making this more economically doable for existing redemption centers, and the issues that they're raising, is there anything that can be done in terms of the geographic distribution and location. And I'm not just talking about remote areas where people, live in a rural area. I'm talking about the state capital,
Yep.
which, as you know, has not had a redemption center for a number of years. And for someone like me that lives north of here, 10 or 12 miles, and was in Montpelier all the time. In order to redeem, I now have to drive another 10 or 12 miles to Barry, which for $9 or $10 worth of bottles doesn't make
Right.
sense for me. So is there anything that can be done to just incentivize by I'm going to say unserved areas?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good way to categorize it. Well, I'll jump to my next slide. Consumer convenience.
Okay.
You're absolutely right. The bottle bill can't be a successful system if it's not convenient to return beverages. And this is sometimes the case today and becoming increasingly more so because of the challenges that redemption centers are facing. And I really think of this as an issue of equity because, as you mentioned, that both the capital, I live in downtown Burlington, both of these highly populated downtown areas are unserved by redemption centers. And these are areas where folks are more likely to not have reliable transportation. So if they can't get the money back, as Paul said, it's essentially a tax, which is not equitable for some types of people to not be able to get their money back. And so what we advocated for in the Senate version of the PRO, and one of the biggest reasons why we think we should move ahead with this model, is that the PRO will have the resources and the responsibility to create more redemption centers using these convenience standards. And there were 2 that were in there and 1 that we'd be pushing for this year. The 2 that were in there were at least 3 redemption points of redemption per county, at least 1 per municipality of 7,000 or more. That gets Montpelier in there. And we would be pushing also to add 1 per designated downtown district. And on top of that, have A&R use GIS technological surveying to find the more rural areas as well that are underserved by redemption centers and place more there as well. But it is a top concern, and I'm glad that you brought it up.
Good to hear.
Was there another question before that? Great. So,
I'm sorry.
Representative Sibilia, just reminding members to ask through me, please.
Yes, sorry, Madam Chair. Can you just say a little bit more about your 4th one, which is not up there, using GIS?
Yep.
And so that's something that you will be advocating for?
yes, so we had a conversation with Matt Chapman leading up to thinking about the bottle bill for this year. And last year in the bill, there was a convenience standard that was no one should have to drive more than 15 minutes to get to a redemption center. That was kind of controversial because folks didn't really understand how that, what if someone had a 10-minute long driveway type of situation, and how is that really fair? So we were talking with Matt about what could replace that. And this was actually his suggestion of something that the agency would be able to do. And so we'll be advocating for that to be in the bill as just an additional step to ensure convenience.
I'd love to work with you on that.
Great. So because of everything I've laid out, we really feel that not doing anything is not an option. This legislation would provide enormous relief to redemption centers, to Vermonters, and also result in these huge environmental benefits. And after 30 years of no meaningful change, it is really time. The pandemic has put stresses on small businesses across the board, but redemption centers are very vulnerable. And this is not just happening in Vermont. Other states are struggling with their antiquated bottle bills. And we have been really thoughtfully kind of picking different parts of different bottle bills across the country and across the world that are uniquely tailored to Vermont and really set us up for success in the Vermont context to have a really profitable and thriving redemption system. Also to reiterate, more than 4 out of 5 Vermonters support this as well. And the last thought that I want to add, this is why I have the Fox picture here, is that while we were ultimately willing to go along with this PRO model for all the reasons I have described, I do want to say there are definitely dangers with having an industry-run program because you are essentially letting the fox guard the hen house. And so for this reason, We would suggest multiple enforcement mechanisms to hold producers accountable to achieving high redemption rates, for consumer convenience and for protecting redemption centers. And we would not feel comfortable with the PRO allowing the PRO to run the bottle bill without these additional accountability mechanisms. So I will end there. Thank you so much for your time and happy to answer additional questions.
Great, thank you very much. Excuse me. Remember, so we will be probably doing walkthroughs of the house. There's a household hazardous waste bill that passed this body last year, and then the bottle bill as it more closely as it really passed the Senate, or did it pass the Senate? Yeah, but not in time. Last year, probably next week. So in sort of follow up to this conversation. Yes.
Possibly have, I think Representative Marcotte would be a good witness to have in here if you'd like to hear
Yes.
someone that owns a small business, what their thoughts are on.
Mhm. We'll have to give him time to look at the new bill, but yes, that's a good idea.
He was in last year.
He did?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
This is the sheet.
And over here. No, I don't. Okay, I'm not seeing any further discussion or questions, so we will adjourn for today, and tomorrow's Friday. So we start with the floor, and then 15 minutes after the floor, we come to committee. And then the governor's budget address is tomorrow at 1.